Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the Sumy region where we see that the Ukrainians have managed to advance in several directions to expand their foothold across the Russian border and into the Kursk region. The Ukrainians first started out by attacking in two directions, direction of Sutsha and then again here in the northern direction. Since then, the Sutsha direction has reached somewhat of a stalemate as the Ukrainians are trying to pressure the Russian defenses in the area, and the Russians are holding on to their defensive positions to prevent a Ukrainian breakthrough. The Russians have a defensive line spanning from the south of Sutsha all the way north to Luknia. Following this development, on the second night of the battle, the Ukrainians advanced in several directions east of Svetligovo towards Lebedevka and north along the road to capture the village agglomeration of Zeleny Shliach, Novo Ivanovka, and Leonidovo. These three villages were captured on the eastern parts of the road, and across the river line that goes here in the western flank, the Ukrainians have also crossed that to enter the villages of Tolsy Lug, Lyubimovka, Pokrovsky, and Obuchovka. All of these villages have Ukrainian military presence within them. The Ukrainians have advanced in every direction from this road to create a defensive line on the western flank of Sutsa to create this defensive line that spans this area right here. This will act as the line of defense between Koronevo and Sutsha. The reason for this is that this road connects to the Russian military presence here in the Kursk region west of Kursk. Then there's the direct connection between Kursk and Sutsha as the second military agglomeration, and then there's the third one which goes in the direction of Belgorod, which is further away. But the Russian military presence was concentrated in these two areas, which the Ukrainians now have successfully separated from each other with this offensive operation. It is likely that the Ukrainians will not advance much further in a western direction as the Russians are already launching counterattacks to try and hit the Ukrainian positions there. The main fights will likely take place here in the direction of Sutsha, where the Ukrainians will continue pushing in this direction. However, the interesting part is that beyond the recent advances that the Ukrainians have made in the area, that according to some reports, this is not going to be the main push. It's reported so far that at least one brigade and two battalions have entered into the Kursk region from the Ukrainian side. This is somewhere in the few thousand soldiers, and there are dozens of armored vehicles accompanying these soldiers. I believe that there are two possibilities with this offensive operation. The first one is that the Ukrainians are pulling their reserves here in the Sumy region towards the Kursk region to launch an actual offensive operation, reminiscent of the Kharkiv counteroffensive that the Ukrainians launched in 2022, to gain some leverage in the negotiation process in the future. This is also to show Western partners that Ukraine is capable of launching offensive operations. They're not limited to the current situation. They still have the potential to recapture more territory. Therefore, they need more support. So that is what this offensive operation seems to be. It is either that or a distraction. It could be a distraction for a second front. Some have pointed out that it could be towards the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, where the Ukrainians would be planning a crossing over the Dnieper River and launch an offensive here, because that is the one area in this section of the front line that is largely undefended. The Ukrainians would have to go through the Surovikin line here in the east, or they would have to cross the Dnieper River into several lines of fortified positions of the Russians along the Kherson region. But in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant area, there is largely no defensive positions of the Russians. Therefore, some claim that this could be the target. There's also the possibility that they could be launching it in the east, or a counterattack to regain control over Vovchansk and Hlyboke to fully push the Russians out of the Kharkiv region as well. So there are multiple possibilities for what the Ukrainians could be doing if this is a diversion. However, we have to look at the facts. Now, going back to the developments, we have a few pictures and geolocated footage. We have this one, for example, which shows the Ukrainian presence in Leonidovo, where we see that they have managed to send armored vehicles all the way to that section and are being hit by Russian artillery, airstrikes, and FPV drones. We see that the Russians are largely hitting all of these Ukrainian positions with their artillery, air force, and FPV drones, while they prepare their ground forces to move in for a counterattack. At the same time, we see that the Ukrainians are able to push onto the first line of defense of the Russians in Sucha, where fighting is taking place between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in the area. The Russian presence here in the north is largely non-existent. The Ukrainians have managed to take up positions all in these areas largely without any resistance. It was largely just Russian air force and heavy bombardment on these Ukrainian positions that they had to drive through with constant bombardment, and they had to clear minefields. But the actual Russian positions in the area were largely spread around. They weren't concentrated in any area, and it was largely dependent on border guards. The Russians did have a few units in the area. They weren't very numerous. The Ukrainians significantly outnumbered them. So they tried to slow down the Ukrainians while withdrawing from some of these villages. An example of such a village is Oleshina, where the Russians were present within the village and they had to fight but were pushed back from it. Now, some claim that the Ahmed Special Forces was just running away as soon as the Ukrainians appeared. That is not true. The Ahmed units in this area, this section of the front line, are special forces, which are the DRGs. They are for reconnaissance into the Ukrainian section of the border, and it is also FPV operators. These are soldiers that are not frontline soldiers. Instead, if they were standing at the front, that would be the biggest mistake that they could do. Some of them were also captured among the border guards that were also captured. However, the Ukrainian POWs that they've captured is not very much because the frontline troops were not really that many. What we do see is that the Ukrainians have had much success in the depth and width of their assaults. This has led to the Ukrainians capturing numerous villages and capturing a total of 160 square kilometers in just 24 hours. And this has led to the Ukrainians being able to, if they send additional forces into this, develop the operation further. So if this is not a diversion, then they have a good foothold to develop the offensive further. There are two targets for the Ukrainians just right now and here, and that would be the main target would be Sucha, which again is a concentration of Russian defensive forces in the area. We see them here in the direction of the railway, which is connecting the entirety of the area to their supply lines, and that is the second target of the Ukrainians would be to push in the northern flank of Sucha here by Luknia and cut off the railway from the north. This would limit supplies coming in from the northern parts, and then the connection from the south is too far away from the border unless the Ukrainians enter from another section. That would not be a target or a priority, but simply cutting off the next parts, the northern parts, will allow them to cut off parts of the supplies and develop the offensive operation further in the direction of Sucha, which seems to be the main target of the Ukrainian offensive operation, despite the numerous advances in the northwest. At the same time, there could be some intention by the Ukrainians to also attack Korenovo here to the northwest to develop the offensive operation further. There is no villages of the Russian Kursk region between the Ukrainian positions and Korenovo. This means that they could just drive in a straight line. There's no known fortifications of the Russians either. However, there is likely a large Russian military presence in that direction, as it is well connected with railways and highways to this direction, and the Russian army also has to be connected to Korenovo to deploy their forces in the first line of defense here further north along the Russian and Ukrainian border. So we see that there is multiple directions the Ukrainians can develop into, and right now they're just spreading as much as they can to gain as much land as they can to get a proper foothold across the border area and to develop offensive operation there. Therefore, we can conclude that the Ukrainians have had a lot of success with their offensive operation. It caught the Russian army off guard, and it has allowed them to capture about as much as the Russians captured in the Kharkiv offensive through this time. But the Russians are still holding on to about 200 square kilometers. The Ukrainians have already captured 160 square kilometers, so they're nearing in onto what the Russians have managed to capture in the first few days of the Kharkiv offensive. So we see that they've had about as much success, if not more success, than the Russians in the Russian Kharkiv offensive. So we're seeing that the current situation is that the Ukrainians have taken advantage of this surprise attack to develop an offensive operation into the Kursk region, and that they are sending additional reserves to the northern part of the front line. Whether this is a diversion or a full-on offensive by the Ukrainians is not clear yet, but we will see as time will tell. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.